We are here as men of peace, but we are here also to declare our full and forthright support of what is in great measure a military alliance.
But in the background is a much wider and more suggestive question connected with the fact that Canada seems to have moved from a pre-national to a post-national phase of existence without ever having been a nation.
That bigness and complexity are functions not so much of numbers as of ideas.
We built a country, east and west and north. We built it on an infrastructure that deliberately resisted the continental pressure of the United States. For 120 years we've done it with one signature of a pen. You've reversed that, thrown us into the north-south influence of the United States.
Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of the Red Ensign Live. This is a show where we talk about some of the... We look at viewer questions, we look at some of the issues in current events, and we look at the position of Canada more broadly as it evolves through the times in which we live. I've titled this episode Canada and the Imperial Crisis, because I believe one of the defining features of the period in which we hope to live through is the transformation going on within U.S. politics and how that transformation will transform Canadian politics. For those of you who don't understand Canada's history particularly well or haven't looked at it deeply, Canada went through a transition in the 20th century. It entered the 20th century as a colony of the British Empire, with two competing elite factions: the Laurentian elite, who drew their power from businesses local to Canada, people like Sam Eaton, and the Imperial elite, who drew their power from the British Empire, people like Lord Strathcona, who, though they had business interests in Canada, ultimately the lines of power that they represented terminated in London. Now, as a result of the First and Second World War, imperial decline, blah, 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 that elite dialectic, which dominated Canada through the 19th and early 20th century, collapsed in the 20th century. And we went through the reinvention of Canada, typically termed the invention of Canada, in the post-war period, where Canada ceased to be a client state of Great Britain and became a client state of the United States. We got a new flag, we got a new anthem, we got, a cultural mosaic instead of representing British imperial culture. We got a whole variety of really, really fundamental changes in our society that came out of that. And we entered into a period of elite consolidation where the Laurentian elite had total consensus, a total lock on power. And the story of the late 20th and early 21st century has been the story in Canadian elite politics, has been the story of the collapse of that consensus. First in Quebec and then later in Western Canada, to the point where we now have three competing groups of elites in Canadian politics. The Laurentians are still dominant, but they have competitors in Western Canada and Quebec. But all that began its life with the imperial crisis in the United Kingdom, right? Canada didn't get its current politics because of anything that happened domestically. It got its current politics because the geopolitical situation in which it found itself changed. And so the interests of elites, especially elites who had attachments outside the country, changed dramatically, right? The legs were cut out from underneath the British imperial elite, and the wind was put into the sails of the Laurentian elite, whose industrial interests aligned elegantly with the interests in the United States. We're moving towards a fascinating moment in American politics, where two things are happening at the same time. First, the dominance of Team Blue in American politics is breaking down, and it's breaking down because of the misgovernance of the American empire, right? So, the misgovernance of the American empire had first alienated the military-industrial complex from Team Blue. Remember that the original alignment of the military-industrial complex in the United States was with the FDR regime way back at the foundation of the modern American government. But over the course of the Cold War, that changed, particularly during the period of Reagan. There's a movement where the military-industrial complex is now a Team Red asset, whereas the State Department, for example, is a Team Blue asset. So you've got a genuine, well, at least a semi-genuine elite conflict going on there now. You've got very obvious imperial decay at the edges. I've talked about this extensively if you look at my appearances on Radlib's show, but during the beginning of the 21st century, there were two enormous projects taken on by the American ruling class. One was the integration of China, and the other was the integration of Russia. Both of these projects were complete failures, and all of the assets invested in these projects ended up stranded in the hands of elites within those countries. Right? This is a disaster of epic proportions in the history of the American empire. And it has led us to this moment where you have the conflict in America, which was once kind of fake, starting to become a little bit more real as elites line up against the legacy progressive institutions. And you have civil war within Team Red, because the more important Team Red becomes, the more power is up for grabs in controlling it, the more important it is for competing interests to grab hold of it. And so over the last couple of weeks, you have a civil war waging across the conservative institutions. Probably the most important moment of that civil war is when after Tucker Carlson had hosted Nick Fuentes on his program, the CEO of the Heritage Institution came out and said, we don't cancel people, right? In other words, we are not going to disaffiliate ourselves from Tucker Carlson because he did something that is unacceptable to an element of the donors that are associated with Team Red. And ever since then, there's been an all-out war waged between Mark Levin, Ben Shapiro, all those people, and all of the people who, what I would call, some of them are what I would call OG MAGA people, and some of them are simply aligned in that direction, who would like to be in control of Team Red. And so this civil war is going on. All this at the surface has very little relevance to Canada, except that Canada remains a client state dependent for its current political arrangements on its relationship to the United States. And if the power structure in the United States is going to change, that is going to disrupt the dynamic of politics in this country. And so as we look at this moment of imperial crisis, it is extremely important that we realize that just like as the British Empire declined and then eventually collapsed, it created a profound destabilization in the balance of power within Canadian politics. The relative decline of the United States is already creating very, very serious ripples within Canadian politics. We talked about this when we talked about the tariffs and the way in which the fairly long-run gambit by the Western elite to pair themselves with Team Red in the United States just collapsed under the force of the ignorance. Well, collapsed under the the force of the well, it collapsed as a consequence of the tariff agenda, right? So, and so not only did Trump single-handedly win the election for Mark Carney, but he also undermined fundamentally the structure of the Conservative Party of Canada. And as we go through today's particular crisis in Canadian politics, understand that its roots are there, right? The roots of the effort to shake control of the Conservative Party out of the hands of the Western Canadian oligarchy are in Trump's move, which isolated the Western elite from what they felt were their American sponsors. So that's why this stream is titled "The Canada and the Imperial Crisis." The other reason I titled it this is that this publication released 2 very large essays, things I very rarely do, on Canada's experience. Well, they're nominally biographies of Sir Arthur Currie, but they more broadly address Canada's experience in the First World War. And I want to parallel what I view as Currie's failure to the very difficult situation that the current Canadian elite find themselves in, and what I would view as the openings that exist for some new and better politics for this country that are to emerge in the future. But first things first, we've got Mr. Shapiro here laying out his case for his version of MAGA, and his version of MAGA is a particular foreign policy agenda, and it is a version of Team Red politics in which the client group, particularly in which white men are not a client group, they're just expected to show up by default, right? And so you have this statement that I pulled, but you could also have pulled his particular statements that say that the left's attacks on white men have created an identity group that seeks to have identity politics of its own, which is both true, but inflected in a very particular way, right? Shapiro views this as a threat, as do a very large number of people from his background, for reasons that are beyond the scope of this stream. Contrasted with Mr. Trump, who has decided that the way to shore up his increasingly fraught political position is to promise to write checks for $2,000 to every American, particularly low and middle income Americans, and to claim that those checks are going to be sourced from tariff revenue, and that those tariff revenues will also be used to substantively pay down the national debt. Right? There's 6 levels of crazy here, but broadly speaking, tariff revenue, something on the neighborhood of 100 billion, U.S. national debt, something in the neighborhood of 30 trillion. You can't substantially pay down 30 trillion with 100 billion. The math doesn't work. But this is a very excellent political strategy, right? So he is explicitly trying to play to his kind of white working class base by writing them checks in classic client patron fashion in order to cut the legs from under the Ben Shapiro faction within Team Red, right? And to get back control of the agenda. I don't think this is going to work, but this is what's going on. And not only do I not think this is going to work, you have to be very short-sighted to not see how incredibly destructive this kind of behavior is for the power of the United States in the long term. we're at the stage where, you know, we're at the stage where checks are going out to random people with the name Donald Trump on it in order to shore up political support. That's a level of patronage politics that is incompatible with the kind of empire that the Americans have been running for the last 40 or 50 years. It is, we're not quite at the end yet, but we're a lot closer to the end than the beginning of this empire, unless something very, very unexpected happens. All right, so there's the kind of geopolitical context in which we're operating. And we just had a moment here in Canada where our esteemed leader, Mark Carney, brought to the floor a budget struggling for support, and had two Conservative MPs cross the floor as part of the action to support this budget, right? So Carney's government will live on, and it will live on with a near majority. I'm not sure exactly how many seats away from majority he sits right now, but it's very, very close, razor's edge. It's significant that these two Conservative MPs are from a group of MPs called Red Tories. Red Tories are a traditional name in Canada for MPs from Eastern Canada who are culturally quite conservative, but economically quite left-wing. And you can kind of see how this political formula works really well in Atlantic Canada, where social cohesion is fairly high, it's fairly white, and it is, and you're dealing with very much working class people. And so Mark Carney's budget, with its $80 billion worth of deficit spending, near COVID levels of deficit spending, appeals very strongly to this group of people, and was designed quite explicitly to break either the Red Tories or the parts of the PQ coalition that are most sensitive to federal dollars. Right. That's always the design. Always was the design. Always was how it was planned to pass. The fact that he got these guys to actually cross the floor because they so resent Western Canadian leadership of the Conservative Party is kind of amazing, but it's very important to kind of see this, to understand it for what it is, to understand that this is a reproducible effect. It's essentially a bribery effect. It's not a great sign for the future of the country, but it's not surprising either. And anyone who has gone online and engaged in performative outrage that these guys are crossing the floor is demonstrating their ignorance of Canadian political history. This is, not very surprising, and nor is it. When I responded to this on Twitter, I responded to it on two levels. First of all, if you're surprised by this, you're demonstrating your ignorance of Canadian politics. But second, if you view this as undesirable, I find it kind of hard to emotionally connect with that view, because to view this as undesirable means that you think it would be very, very valuable for the Carney government to collapse, us to go back to the polls and presumably get like a minority conservative government under Pierre Poilievre. I can't imagine why you would want this. I mean, maybe you want this because you think there's some hypothetical deal available with the Trump government. I find that almost impossible to believe. I think the propaganda value of beating up on Canada is far greater than the economic value of any deal that might actually be made between the Trump government and the Canadian government over trade. I don't think you're going to see a deal for years at this point, probably not until after the Trump presidency. And so I can't get into the mind frame of imagining that collapsing this government in favor of a Conservative Party of Canada government is desirable enough to be outraged by the fact that it didn't happen. That said, this budget is exactly what this publication predicted it would be: a massive package of patronage framed as necessary deficit spending to get Canada through the short-term turmoil of the tariffs. And so you have this enormous deficit that's part of it. This is the Fraser Institute doing its duty as a think tank to be outraged by the lack of fiscal responsibility shown by the Carney government. You know, if you thought the Carney government was going to be fiscally conservative, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. Maybe you need to make more donations to the Fraser Institute in order to ensure that we have good fiscally responsible government in this country in the future. I don't know what to tell you. But what you see here is some actual investments in infrastructure in Canada and enormous payouts to every client group that supports the Laurentian elite in this country. And so you will see that there are two really interesting things that are in this budget. First is there's a significant rationalization in the federal bureaucracy that's gone on. Looks like they're going to fire 16,000 people, aimed at firing 40,000 people by 28-29. So that's an interesting thing that's come out of the Carney government. They've decided that they actually want to improve the efficiency of the federal bureaucracy, at least to some degree. And the other thing that's kind of interesting in this government is that it has substantial reductions to immigration, particularly the TFW program and particularly the student visa program. So we've talked about this in terms of what has already happened in advance of the budget. But it's important here to note that the CBC, of all people, is out here telling us that the temporary immigration cuts are insufficient, right? So the mouthpiece of the Canadian far left is telling us that the cuts to the temporary foreign workers program, the mainstay of migration to this country through the Trudeau era, are insufficient. All right. For those who lectured Kryptos and I about how the pivot wasn't going to happen, this is a profound change in the environment in this country. That said, the number of permanent spots for points-based immigration only declined something like 50,000, from like 450,000 to just over to in the high 300,000s. So you see the Carney government again trying to pick this middle way where they try to balance in migration with the population decline of this country in order to get to this perfect technocratic optimum where the population of the country stays static and they avoid dealing with the consequences of either a housing crisis or housing devaluation on the other side, in order to kind of stick everything in place so that they maintain their political position within the country. So that's the effort that's underway. Again, the strategy from the Carney government is straightforward. Their plan is to wait out the Trump administration, fight the good fight, lecturing Donald Trump about his, poor credentials as a liberal, and to try to technocratically reform Canada in order to shore up their power within the structure. Big payoffs to their client groups in order to shore up their power. Some SOPs to economic infrastructure to try to undermine some of their rivals within Confederation. And very likely intentionally keeping this conflict with the Trump administration going in order to kind of keep the Canadian left in behind them. So that's the government that we have in Canada right at the moment. I think it's important to place this kind of behavior in Canadian history. So as those of you who follow my Substack will know, I spilled something like, I don't know, several thousand words, way more than I would ordinarily write for any good reason, this Remembrance Day, writing this biography of Sir Arthur Currie in 2 parts. And I did it for a couple of reasons. The first and most important reason is that Canadians, in order to have a sense for themselves in a period of time where our history is being intentionally erased in order to undermine our sense of identity, have an obligation to reflect on the achievements of our ancestors. So in a season where the government of Canada is releasing a Remembrance Day stamp with a Sikh soldier on it, one of 10 who illegally served in the Canadian Army during World War I, 10 of out of something like 1.1 million soldiers who served in the Canadian Army in that conflict. They're doing that very intentionally in order to write their program of ethnic replacement into our history, okay, and to erase the memory of our ancestors. That's deeply personally offensive to me. It's also political strategy that cannot be allowed to succeed if we're to have a future. And so it's important that all of us who have some, bent towards writing or the creation of content in this current moment, make some effort to remind ourselves who we are as a people, what our history is, what we have to live up to. So that's one reason why I did that. But the second reason I don't want to be lost, in my opinion, Arthur Currie is a quintessential Canadian tragic hero. And he's a tragic hero because he gets caught in a web of warring duties. On the one hand, Arthur Currie comes from nothing. He's the sixth child. You have to check the biography to make sure, but he's one of the later children out in a family of 8, or a family of 8 children in southwestern Ontario. And he goes out west to make his fortune, and he kind of flops around. He doesn't have any real financial success, so he joins the army because what else can you do? And he continues to fail in his efforts to make money in Western Canadian real estate. He fails so badly that he actually illegally appropriates regimental funds in order to pay off his personal debts on the eve of World War I. And he only escapes being driven out of the army because the war breaks out. And by the time the new regimental commander figures it out, he's already on a boat over to France. So this is a man who comes from nothing. He joins as an enlisted man, enters the officer corps at the right time, and has an opportunity to become a figure in world history because of this coincidence of events. And he enters into world history, I think, in his late 40s and early 50s. So I think that's kind of important to note. There's a lot of discourse right now that suggests that all great men are kind of young men. This is not the case. There are a number of figures in Anglo history, Arthur Currie being one, very famously Oliver Cromwell another, who have this very sleepy life as young men where they learn skills that become essential to them. But in both cases, the skills they learn leave them with a tragic flaw. Arthur Currie, in the years before the war, he comes up as an artillery officer, and by the time he enters the First World War, he knows everything that there is to know about the operation of artillery and everything that there is to know about how to discipline a group of men to stand their ground, right? Two absolutely essential skills that will become very, very important in World War I. He learns this in breaking miners' strikes. He learns this in enforcing drill in like horrendous conditions, both prior to getting to Europe and afterwards. But what he's not prepared for is that so he is a very successful commander in the first part of World War One, and distinguishes himself profoundly at Passchendaele. You can read this in the piece. He gets a political sponsor out of that in Julian Byng, who was then the commander of the Canadian Corps. And when Byng is promoted after the victory at Vimy Ridge, so both before and shortly after, he and Julian Byng and Arthur Currie set out to remake the Canadian Corps based on new doctrine intended to make a intended to avoid the horrendous loss of life that came from offenses in the early stages of war on the Western Front. And they do it really, really well. The victory at Vimy Ridge is kind of the first piece of it, but there's an opportunity when Julian Byng is promoted to take the Canadian Corps. There's 4 divisions in the Canadian Corps. A 5th division is forming in London. There's a thought the politicians in Ottawa want to break the Canadian Corps. They want to make a Canadian Army group, right? The Canadian Army is intended to have 8 divisions, which means that all the divisions, the 4 divisions plus the forming 5th division, are going to be half-strength divisions, and they're going to form an army, and they're going to conduct operations on their own. And Currie prevents this. He prevents this at tremendous personal cost. He makes enormous enemies back in Ottawa, but also he prevents, by declining the promotion for himself, he also declines the promotion on behalf of all of his subordinate officers. And he does so in order to make the Canadian Corps the best warfighting machine he could possibly make them. He takes the soldiers of the 5th Division and he creates 4 overstrength divisions with a particular emphasis on increasing the Corps of Engineers. And he does this because what Byng and Currie had observed in the early stages of the Western Front is that no offensive could actually succeed on the Western Front because when you advanced, you got out of the cover range of your massed artillery. And so your ability to advance was always limited by how quickly you could bring forward your artillery, and your artillery couldn't pass through the mud of no man's land without rails and roads being laid. And so you could only advance as a force as fast as your Corps of Engineers could lay new rail and new road to advance the artillery, so that you could use your massed artillery to defeat the next group of enemies. The group of enemies on the other side, as you're advancing, have their rail already formed, so they can bring in fresh troops, and more importantly, they can bring in fresh artillery, so that they're fighting with artillery and you're fighting with small arms in the second stage of the offensive, when you're trying to translate the offensive into a breakout. Currie takes his 5th Division and creates much thicker Corps of Engineers, which make the Canadian Corps certainly on the Allied side in the Western Front, the most effective offensive force that exists during the entire war, bar none. And it would be unfair to say turns the tide of the Western War, but certainly the war doesn't end in November 1918 without this being done. The Canadian Corps is the most important is one of the most important elements and the most successful element of the 100 Days Offensive that brings an end to the war. So that's his story, except that because he does this, not only does he alienate the politicians in Ottawa and all of his brother officers, but because he guarantees that the Canadian Corps are always going to be the spearhead of the offensives in the later stages of the war, he also alienates his own men. And so he comes back to Canada having all of his political eggs in the basket of, well, I helped deliver a victory for the British Empire in the First World War. Well, it turns out that after the war, the British Empire is broke and completely unable to support him politically. He spends the next 10 years of his life defending himself from false accusations, fighting libel lawsuits aimed at members of parliament, and he dies. He ends up buried in a family plot with no state honors, or very limited state honors. Is eventually corrected, and he gets buried in a more prominent location, but he's treated as a persona non grata within Canada because he chose to side with the empire and its objective of winning the war, rather than with either of the factions in domestic Canadian politics. He could have collected the support of his brother officers, who are all connected to the Imperial elite in London, or he could have collected support from his men and the kind of populist force that would have existed within Canadian politics after the war. Or he could easily have collected both by accepting the reorganization of the Canadian Corps. Instead, he sides with his nominal sponsors in the empire, his perceived duty, and he's punished for it. And the people he served are unable to reward him or Canada at any point in the future. My view is that a similar situation is going on with the Liberal Party in Canada, who are fighting on behalf of a dying force in Canadian politics, that dying force being the blue American elite. Conversely, the Conservative Party want to align themselves with Red America, who I also think is not a genuine partner in this relationship, right? Members of the CPC coalition, both just like regular members, but also the Alberta elite, tend to think that they're aligned in fighting one war, one struggle with Red America. But Red America has no interest in the struggle of Western Canada against Central Canada, right? It's just a plaything for them. They'll discard it whenever it's convenient. And so I would highly caution emerging Canadian, I mean, if any of them would listen, I would guide each of these people to not assume that the declining American empire is going to be able to reward them in Canadian politics in the future. But given that I highly suspect that the leaders of the Liberal and Conservative coalitions are not listening to this podcast, what I would say is that there are relationships that can be pursued with international elites of one kind or another that will benefit the Canadian elite, which will one day rule this country, or one day at least lead this people. However, our loyalty ought to be first and foremost to the Canadian people, right? Our interest, we ought to see our long-term interest as inextricably tied up with that people, because the international relationships that appear to exist, that appear as opportunities in this moment, are ephemeral. They will disappear as the geopolitical situation evolves. And so don't spend your strength fighting on behalf of Donald Trump or fighting on behalf of Nigel Farage or fighting on behalf of some other populist leader or even fighting on behalf of Blue America if you are going the Richard Spencer route, or on behalf of some other emergent force in the politics of the late imperial period in America or in the American Empire. The reality is that whatever the political organization that we live under, our task is to form an elite which is both spiritually and by interest bonded to the Canadian people unshakably, that sees their interest as our interest and our interest as their interest. That's the project. It's a project which will require parallel institutions. It's a project that will require opting out of certain kinds of opportunities. It's a project which will involve shared suffering. But that is the project. Otherwise, you might as well give up on this people and deracinate. And so that's where we are as a people, and I think it's important to look at what I view as the failure of our forefathers in this regard, to kind of understand our position, understand the pitfalls on either side. I mean, the other obvious pitfall is to take advantage of none of those opportunities and get outcompeted and get left behind. And so this is the course that we have to articulate. We have to use the opportunities of late empire to strengthen ourselves without our bonds of loyalty being attached to that empire. Without our bonds of kind of a feudal relationship lining up in that direction. And so, those are the prepared topics for the stream. I wanted to do some Q&A as well. So I will, I'll go through some of the questions that are on the Twitter post that announced this stream, and then I'll see if there's any questions in the live chat, and I'll address those as well. So the first question that's in the Q&A for the stream is comes from a Twitter guy with 3 followers who I don't really know. He makes the point that there's a whole collection of people who are either Americans or associated with the Conservative Party of Canada, who make the point that Canada has been a poor partner on security with the United States in recent years, right? They point to low military spending. They point to issues in drug enforcement along the Canadian border. They look at a number of these issues and say, well, because Canadians have been a poor partner, then we need to, I'm not even sure what they think they need to do. Some of them are like 51st staters or something. Some of them think we need to like side with Trump against the Canadian people or something in rhetoric, or side with Trump against the Laurentian elite, I guess. There's a couple of points I want to make here. First of all, Canada, any service that Canada provides to the American Empire, in terms of fighting its wars for it, needs to be on a transactional basis, right? The core of the Canadian population have always had a warrior ethos. There are a huge number of Canadians who that's just their vocation. They were put on this earth to fight wars, and so they will always sign up for the military. If there wasn't a Canadian military, they'd sign up for the American military, or they'd sign up to be mercenary contractors or whatever. That's just how they're wired. That's how they were made. It is important that we don't mistake participating in the wars of the empire for the suggestion that they are our wars on behalf of our interest. They are not. And so any support that we offer to the defense of the American empire has to be transactional. We do our part and they give us something in return. To this point, the American empire has given us poverty and given us and imposed an elite upon us who teach us to hate our own people and our own history. And so I don't think that's worthy of any loyalty. I'm not ashamed that Canada has not pulled its weight in NATO operations. I wish they would do less. I wish we had done less because the services that we rendered were not repaid. And anybody who stands and makes this point as a Canadian is misguided, and I think they really ought to be ashamed of themselves. What have the Americans ever given us in the post-war era to be worthy of that loyalty? Nothing. Nothing. And so, on the other hand, Canada will always need an army. I wrote a piece, or I forget whether I wrote. No, I didn't. I did a podcast looking at restructuring the Canadian Army from first principles to, if you were to structure it for the purposes of Canadian sovereignty. And interestingly, the Carney government is actually pursuing a lot of the strategies that I raised on that podcast. Why they're pursuing them is an interesting question, because the restructure that they're making, on the one hand, you could say that it's targeted at the prospect of fighting a war against Russia in the high Arctic. On the other hand, it's exactly the same set of maneuvers you would make if you were trying to prepare a Canadian army for an eventuality where Canada would have to exert its own sovereignty. So that's interesting. I'm not a fan of the Carney government, but that is a positive development in my view. So that's how I would view that question. I don't think Canada should substantially increase its military spending until there is an elite in control of the Canadian state that is prepared to break away from the American empire. And I don't think we're very close to that. Though interestingly, in their delaying strategy, I kind of think the Carney government is weirdly paving the way for that eventuality. Let me see if there's any other questions that are worth answering here in either the live chat or the Twitter chat. Yeah, I mean, there's not much here that's interesting. What I would say, the last comment that I want to make here is that the best thing that we can do in this moment is to try to grab hold of the future that's in front of us. There are huge elements of the historic Canadian nation who are just content to die as long as they don't have to experience hardship in this moment, right? Content, and by die, I mean, in some sense, they're literally dying via MAID to avoid having to deal with the suffering of the moment. But in a broader sense, they refuse to sacrifice to either build anything or even like have children who might continue that nation. And I would, with every breath in my body, I would like to encourage us to live in the struggle for the future of our own people. Whether it's the small act of trying to, write a publication online to try to remember who we've been and who we might be in the future, whether it's by building your business and your family and your community network. Don't allow yourself to be deracinated and broken from your ancestors and become futureless in this moment. That surrender, there's every kind of force in the world pushing you towards that kind of surrender. But I beg you, Canadians, to refuse. Thank you for your time and attention. And there's one other item here asking about institutional takeover. I think that parallelism is the way forward. I do not think that capturing legacy institutions really has any significant prospect. The institutions that exist in this country are very, very well fortified against takeover and repurpose. Partly because most of the legacy institutions that exist in this country are explicitly financed by the federal government, and the federal government is, very, very well fortified. That said, organizations like the Fraser Institute, or if you think about the think tank network behind the CPC, those are organizations that are of some value to penetrate and try to take over. They've got some legacy capital. They've got some legacy brands. They're not very well defended from attack by the right. They don't really have anything to say that's of value in the current historical moment. And so you can definitely attack those institutions by pointing out that you can give them relevance by changing the perspective that they present. And I look at what Daniel Tyree is doing with the Dominion Society as kind of a form of this, trying to penetrate think tank world. I think there's some value in that. I think there's some value in taking over those institutions. I think there's some value in building new ones. But I would lean very strongly towards building from the ground up rather than trying to take over, unless there are legacy assets that are very valuable and there's a clear path to capturing them. All right. Thanks so much for your time and attention, and I hope you got something out of the stream.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.